I want to welcome everybody to the South Atlantic Board. Because Pat Gear has moved from the DNR, Georgia DNR, over to the Virginia Marine Resources, we just wanted to reaffirm with the board that it is okay for Pat to continue on as chairman. Is there any objection to Pat continuing as chairman of the South Atlantic State Federal Management Board, although he's representing a new state? I see you have no objection, which I'm very pleased to see, and he will continue on as your board chair.
Thank you very much, Tony. Why does that not surprise me one bit that no one had any objections to me staying on? And it's, all right, well, I want to welcome everybody to the South Atlantic Board. My name is Pat Gear. I am the new Deputy Chief at Virginia Marine Resources Commission. The first order of business for today is the approval of the agenda. We have one item under other business that Chris Savage would like to deal with, and that's the mackerel issue in North Carolina. Is there any other additions or changes to the agenda? Hearing none, we'll consider it approved by consent. The approval of the proceedings from the February 2018 meeting. Any changes or modifications? Hearing none, we'll consider it approved by consent. Is there any public comment? I don't have any. I haven't had anybody come up. Mike's shaking his head no, so we'll move on. The first item on the agenda is the Addendum 1 to the Black Drum Fisheries Management Plan for final approval. And Mike is coming up to the table, so Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first of all, we'll be going over the public comment for draft addendum 1. I'll give, before that, some brief background, kind of how we got here. Then we'll move into the public comment, and I'll put up the management options for board consideration. So this process was started in October of 2017 with a proposal from Maryland to reopen their commercial fishery for black drum in the Chesapeake Bay. At that point, the board initiated an addendum, and we are now at the stage of final action for this draft addendum. Public comment was held from February 7th through March 23rd, with one public hearing being held in the state of Maryland. Just a reminder of some of the background related to this draft addendum. There was a historical commercial fishery in Chesapeake Bay for the state of Maryland that operated from 1973 through 1997. That operated, before the late 1990s, with an average annual harvest in that time period of about 11,000 pounds. In the late 1990s, a tagging study was conducted to collect scientific information. Within this study, there was no commercial take, but commercial pound net fishermen were paid for fish that were tagged and released from their nets. This program ended prior to the 2000 fishing season, but the commercial fishery was never reopened. When the Interstate Fishery Management Plan for Black Drum was approved in 2013, this plan prohibited the relaxation of any commercial measures that were in place, and so the moratorium on commercial fishing in the Chesapeake Bay for the state of Maryland continued on in perpetuity. Some of the background related to the stock status. The current reference points from the 2015 assessment, as well as the harvest, are shown on the screen. The stock status from that assessment was not overfished, and overfishing not occurring. The harvest target that came out of that assessment was 2.12 million pounds with a threshold of 4.12 million pounds. And the 2016 total harvest was 1.53 million pounds. And if you'll take a look at the bottom right-hand figure where you can see the harvest, the target has not been really approached for the last about 7 years. This table shows current regulations up and down the coast, and really the main thing to highlight is that Maryland is the only state that has an area closure for commercial fishing of black drum. So the two management options, and it was fairly simple addendum. There were two options. We can either keep it the way it is right now with option 1, or option 2, reopen Maryland's commercial fishery with a 10-fish daily vessel limit and a 28-inch minimum total length size limit. The technical committee reviewed Maryland's proposal prior to the development of the draft addendum. And the TC was contacted, and they maintained their previous recommendation that that approval of this draft addendum would not likely lead to overfishing. They did additionally recommend that Maryland conduct biological monitoring of fish caught by this fishery so that that data can be used in future stock assessments. This is a recommendation, not a requirement. There are no monitoring requirements in the black drum FMP, so that's just something additional that the TC would like to see should this draft addendum be approved. From their previous assessment, the predicted additional harvest is relatively small compared to the coast-wide harvest when thinking about what was brought in during a time period where there were no regulations on that fishery. And adding on that additional harvest would not have caused the coast-wide target or threshold to be approached over the last 7 years. The written public comment, 14 written comments were received, the majority of these supporting option 1 of status quo, with 1 comment supporting option 2 to reopen the fishery in Chesapeake Bay. Much of the written comment focused on black drum being more valuable to the recreational fishery than the commercial, citing specifically poor meat quality from large black drum. There were some concerns in these comments about the targeting of large black drum with the potential for this to reduce the spawning productivity or the availability of large fish that are targeted for a catch and release fishery by the recreational fishermen. There was also concern about disruption overall of recreational fishing activities due to the location of pound nets and the potential for reduced availability of fish overall. This concern was specifically related to the fact that black drum are a recreational alternative to striped bass within that area for a portion of the fishing year. The one comment that supported option 2 did additionally suggest that the gear be limited to only pound nets. As I said previously, 1 public hearing was held in Maryland. At this public hearing, no comments were received. There were 2 board members, 1 member of Maryland staff, and 1 member of the public from CCA Maryland. CCA Maryland wrote an organization letter that's included in the public comment materials, but they didn't offer any comments at the hearing itself. A conference call was solicited to discuss the advisory panel's preferred option. However, no members responded to actually schedule the call. The AP chair, Tom Powers, did provide a written response where he expressed some concern about increasing fishing effort without any cap on the number of entrants or the quota for a species like black drum that has slow growth after reaching maturity. So with that, I will take any questions, and yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike. Are there any questions for Mike? I see Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have a question, but when you're ready, I would address some of the concerns that were expressed.
Okay, are there any questions at all before I go back to Lynn? Seeing none.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to provide a little bit of a little bit of comment about the lack of comment on this from the commercial sector. I've had several questions about that, and one thing I want to stress is that this is something, I think in this case, these commercial fishermen made substantive comment to us as a state. So they arrived at our state commission meetings and provided comment on this. So those are on the record with the state. And I think at that point, they felt like they had added their input. There is one comment that is from a representative of the commercial industry. And then the other thing I wanted to say was there's two concerns in there. One is limiting the gear to only pound nets. Our gill net fisheries for striped bass close at the end of February, and the gill nets that are deployed in the Chesapeake Bay during the time when black drum are encountered, the mesh size is too small. They would not capture black drum, so this really would be a pound net fishery. And the second was to the advisor who expressed concern about increasing effort with no limit on entrance. This is a limited entry fishery in Chesapeake Bay, and the number of pound netters is fairly limited, so this is not an unlimited effort situation. So I hope that clarifies a little bit the public comment. We try hard to work with our commercial fishermen. This means a lot to them, and they certainly did step up to comment to us as a state. Thank you.
Okay, I have John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lynn, could you just follow up? I was just a little confused about that comment that somebody made about the pound nets. It was almost implying that the pound nets would be moved for black. Well, they said the pound nets would be in the way of recreational fishing was one of the comments that was made, right, was to that. And, I mean, these things are usually not moved, are they?
No, pound nets are absolutely stationary to the point where the sites where the pound nets are set are registered with the state, so they are not even remotely a mobile gear. So that if you were to have that situation, the recreational vessel would have to travel to where the pound net is, and that's where the conflict would occur.
On the microphone, John. Lynn, I have a quick question. How long is this season? How long do you think the season would be?
I'm going to ask Mr. Dyes to address that. I think the fish arrive in the spring, April, May. Yeah. Yes. So May and June, it's a spring fishery in Maryland.
Just a couple of months?
Yeah,
Okay.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? I've got one from Greg Waugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lynn, what about the issue of monitoring? Would your state be doing some monitoring of that harvest, should it occur?
You know, we do monitor pound nets currently as part of other species, so I believe, and I would go back and confirm with staff on this, but I believe we are there. We're sampling pound nets, so we can provide some information. Now, the level of that information, if we're talking about things like otoliths and aging, I'm not so sure we can tackle that, but we can return to the board with information on exactly what kinds of data we would gain through our current pound net monitoring.
Okay, I got Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may ask a question of Lynn. Lynn, are these primarily spawning adult fish that would be subject to this harvest, since it's in April or May and June, or are they a variety of size ranges?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I would know the answer to that. The minimum size limit is 28 inches, which is specifically set beyond the age of first spawn, so that there is some ability for the fish to have reproduced before they are caught. As a reminder, when we had a fishery before, this size limit was not in place. So the intent here was to look at when these fish are, I believe 28 inches represents 100% maturity, and that's why the size limit was selected.
Is there any other questions for Lynn or any other comments? This is a final action, so we're going to need a motion from somebody if we want to move forward with this. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move to approve option 2 to reopen Maryland's commercial fishery for black drum in the Chesapeake Bay with a daily vessel limit of up to 10 fish and a 28-inch minimum total length size limit.
I have a second from Doug Heyman. Okay. Any further discussion on this? Mike?
Just one note, Lynn did contact me about an implementation date for this, should it be approved for April 1st, 2019.
Thank you, Mike. I forgot to mention that. All right, is there no other discussion? Since this is a final action, Tony?
This motion is not final action. Once you approve the addendum itself is final action.
I am sorry. Okay. So is there any objection to this motion? Hearing none, the motion carries unanimously. Now the addendum. Correct?
Yeah, now final action on the addendum.
Now we have to do final action on the addendum, which is part of this. Okay, so we need another motion for that.
In addition, we would want an implementation date. Implementation dates can be effective immediately, or at time certain, I would look to the state of Maryland for that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move to approve Addendum 1 to the Fishery Management Plan for Black Drum with an implementation date of April 1st, 2019.
Second by Jim Estes. Any comment or discussion? 2019. Okay, we have it up there.
No,
And I'll read the motion. Move to approve the Addendum 1 to the Black Drum Interstate Fishery Management Plan as modified with the implementation date of April 1, 2019. Motion by Ms. Fegley and seconded by Mr. Estes. Since it is a final action, I'd like to see a show of hands in favor of this motion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Okay.
Without objection.
Any objections? Any abstentions? Any null votes? Motion carries 12 to 0 to 0. Without any objection. Okay. You got that? Okay. All set?
Yep.
All right, moving on. Let's move on to the next item on the agenda. It's
Lunch.
lunch? No, I think we're going to move. We're going to keep moving on. If anybody, we're going to move through and we'll have lunch. Okay. Does anybody have any objections to keep moving on? Because lunch probably isn't even ready yet. Okay. We'll keep moving on then. I thought maybe you were hungry, Mike, so that's why I stopped and asked. All right, the next item on the agenda is item number 5, which is to look at the technical committee's recommendations for the traffic light analysis for Atlantic Croaker and Spot. At the last meeting, we had a presentation by Chris McDonough who's the TC chair, and we basically put off making any decisions or approving any recommendations at that time. So right now I'll have Mike has the floor, and he'll give you a brief discussion on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the board discussed this topic was presented with this topic at the last board meeting, my summary of Chris's presentation will be much briefer, but we do have Jeff Kipp and Kristen Anstead available to ask more technical questions if the board needs a reminder of some of the finer details that were discussed last time. In 2017, both Spot and Croker underwent benchmark assessments. Neither of these assessments were endorsed by the peer review panel for management, due in part to conflicting signals from the abundance and harvest time series. Both species are monitored annually using an annual traffic light approach. This was established in 2014, and I believe most members of this board are familiar with the TLA approach, but it assigns color of red, yellow, or green, categorizing relative levels of indicators on the condition of the fish population using an abundance metric or the fishery using a harvest metric. Management action is triggered if both abundance and harvest are tripped for 2 consecutive years or 3 consecutive years currently for Spot and Croker respectively. And the trigger would occur if that TLA shows a percentage of red that is greater than 30% with moderate concern, with action resulting from moderate concern, or if the percentage of red exceeds 60%, then that represents significant concern. The current TLAs have not triggered management action despite declining trends in harvest to some of the lowest values on record. And several of the abundance indices developed for the assessments that occurred in 2017 are not currently included in the TLA. So with the discrepancy that occurred in the trends between harvest and abundance, that led the traffic light approach subcommittee to begin reevaluating the available data for Spot and Croker. They redeveloped the indices, looking at them in terms of recruitment and adult indices, also reconsidering which indices should be included in the TLA. They considered inshore-offshore approaches, mid-Atlantic versus South Atlantic approaches. There were really a suite of things that were presented during the February meeting, and those are outlined in the briefing materials in the TC memo. Here's a list of the recommendations that were made for the Spot traffic light analysis, and trying to summarize and run through these. There were 2 additional analyses that the technical committee recommended for inclusion in the Spot TLA. Those were chest map and the Program 195 survey from North Carolina Department of Marine Fisheries. The TC also recommended the use of age length keys and length composition information from each of the surveys to estimate the number of adults. There was some information where there was bleed in of juveniles into the numbers, so the TC made that recommendation. The TC also recommended the use of a regional approach in which chest map and the currently used NEFSC bottom trawl survey would characterize from Virginia north, and the Program 195 survey as well as CMAP would characterize south of the Virginia-North Carolina border. Fourth, the TC recommended use of a recruitment index as well as information from the southeastern shrimp trawl fishery as auxiliary information. These would not affect the management triggers themselves, but they would be provided on an annual basis for consideration should any management action be taken. Fifth, the TC recommended changing the reference time period for all surveys to be 2002 through 2012. And finally, the TC recommended changing the triggering mechanism, whereas right now the triggering mechanism for spot requires the last 2 years of the time series for both abundance and harvest to trip in order for management action to be triggered. The TC recommended that any 2 of the 3 terminal years be used, and using the same 30% and 60% thresholds as far as moderate versus significant concern. How this plays out relating status quo to what the recommendation from the TC would be. So what we see on the screen right now is the current TLA updated through 2016. And what you see is harvest shows very high proportions of red, but abundance using the NIMFS and the CMAP surveys has not tripped since 2007. However, in taking in all of the TC's recommendations using the regional TLA with the revised indices and the revised reference period, we see right here the South Atlantic region would not have tripped for abundance or harvest in recent years, but the Mid-Atlantic region would have tripped, and if all of these changes were to be adopted, because the 2 terminal years for both abundance and harvest have exceeded that 30% proportion, if the 2 out of 3 terminal year management trigger were adopted, that means that regardless of what is seen in 2017, there will be management action triggered. For Croaker, many of these recommendations are the same or very similar, so I'm just going to highlight the underlined portions of this list rather than the Program 195 survey to characterize the South Atlantic region for Croaker. We would use the South Carolina DNR TramelNet survey. Adult Croaker are considered to be adults at age 2+ rather than age 1+ for spot. But similarly, the age length and length composition information would be used. And then finally, at the last recommendation, rather than 2 out of 3 of the terminal years being used for the triggering mechanism for Croaker due to differences in their life history, the TC recommended any 3 out of the 4 terminal years. So looking similarly at how differences would go into effect should the board adopt all of the TC's recommended changes. We see the current TLA through 2016. Harvest has high proportions of red in the terminal years, but abundance does not have high proportions of red. If we went with the recommended approach, the South Atlantic region for the abundance index, that would not have triggered in recent years. The harvest index would have triggered in recent years, but because we don't have both abundance and harvest triggering, management action wouldn't be initiated. However, looking at the Mid-Atlantic, we have a similar situation as was the case for spot, where in the last 3 years, 2015, 16, and 17, that 30% threshold of red is exceeded for both the adult abundance as well as the harvest metrics. That being the case, regardless of what happens in 2017 when the TLA is updated, if the board were to adopt all of the changes that are recommended by the TC, management action would be triggered for the Mid-Atlantic region for Croaker as well. So in summary, the TC recommended several changes to the annual TLAs. Incorporating all of the recommendations would trigger moderate concern management action in 2018 for both species in the Mid-Atlantic, and that, again, Mid-Atlantic being defined from Virginia north. And incorporation of all recommendations as far as process goes. This would require an addendum to the Spot and Croker FMPs. We would likely go about this as a joint addendum process, so we would hold public hearings, and as far as writing the document, it would encompass both species at once, so it wouldn't be too separate. The previously discussed course of action that can be referenced in the minutes from the last meeting would be for today for the board to task the PDTs. The Croker PDT would need to be repopulated. There currently is not a Croker PDT, but the PDTs would need to be tasked to investigate potential management responses to the triggers in the Mid-Atlantic from the revised TLA. In August, the board would review the updated TLA through 2018 using both the current method as well as the revised method, and there would be some feedback from the PDT on potential management responses to that updated information, at which point an addendum would be initiated. October would be where the board would review the draft addendum for public comment, and final approval after a public comment period would occur potentially in February of 2019. Some of the feedback that would be needed for the PDTs to put this process into action would be how much or what type of a reduction is the board looking for as far as responding to that Mid-Atlantic trigger. And in talking to some board members, there's been some concern about the impacts of the shrimp trawl fishery. So there would be a question of, can anything be done? What is the will of the board, the power of the board to look at the effects or impact the effects of the shrimp trawl fishery versus the actual harvest? And with that, I will take any questions.
Thanks, Mike. I'll open the floor for questions for Mike. Any questions? Mike, I have one. It's if the Mid-Atlantic is triggering, how will the trawl fishery in the southeast, meaning North Carolina through Georgia, how would that play into the Mid-Atlantic abundance?
That's a good question, and that's one that can be posed to the PDTs and TC members. I don't know that I have an answer directly for that. That has just been a concern that's been expressed to me from others.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I understood that the PDT and perhaps the TC is going to be looking for guidance from the board on the magnitude of reduction. And I'm a little, and this is the heart of my question, because this is a traffic light analysis, is the technical committee going to have any ability to tell us what the magnitude of reduction would need to be to get us down below those triggers? I'm a little concerned that we're headed into a game of ping pong between the board and the TC, because I honestly don't, I'm not entirely sure. I can't really put together in my head, how you would calculate a magnitude, what the magnitude of action would need to be.
I guess more of what I was looking for, and what I'm hoping to be able to provide to the PDT is that getting below the 30% threshold, is that what the board would desire, or would the board desire something further down, getting below a 15% red or any other magnitude? That's kind of what I'm going for, not as much specific numeric requirement, but what would be the end goal relative to the TLA that the board would want to see spot or croaker end up at.
Lynn, follow it.
So if we were to task the TC to look at management options, would they be able to give us magnitudes over time frame? So for example, in year 1, you would have to do this much to get below that threshold level, or if you wanted to achieve it in year 2, you would have to proceed as follows. Could they give us that level of detail?
I think they could certainly try. I think that's something that could be asked of them, and I would have to pose that to the people that would be running more of the numbers to get the full answer on that.
Tony?
I think it would be helpful for the TC and the PDT if the board could give them some parameters in which you're wanting them to investigate. So for example, hitting a target which ranges from 15 to 45% around the thresholds, or whatever number you want it to be around the threshold, and then a time frame in which to achieve those, anywhere from 1 to 5 years or 1 to 10 years, but otherwise that they'll have endless combinations, and if we can narrow down their focus, it would be helpful for them. And then the other thing is that if they are going to have to describe management tools, are there non-starter management tools that you don't even want to look at, or do you want them to look at all management tools? Are there outside of the box management tools that you're looking for? Would be helpful.
Any follow-up to that? Any comments? Any ideas? Lynn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is very difficult, but I would say that just as a start to ideas, and we've discussed this with our stakeholders internally, particularly for spot, because this is an animal that is very important to the charter industry in particular, I think that size limits would be something that would be difficult for us at the start, just because of the different sizes of animal. And so I hesitate to say let's not examine size limits, but it's going to be a very tricky issue. And I would also say that perhaps because for spot in Maryland, we have regulations in place on croaker, and I think we may be one of the few that does. We have no regulations on spot. I guess anytime you go from an unregulated fishery to a regulated fishery, and given the less quantitative nature of the stoplight, I think it would be my inclination to step in, to phase in, go there more slowly than more quickly. I don't know if that's specific guidance. I'm just throwing that out there for discussion from my colleagues around the table.
Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Lynn. I think if we needed to look at narrowing down the potential management options, I think a minimum size limit for spots, one to eliminate right off the bat, just due to how the fishery, commercial and recreational fishery operates, and also based on the life history of the fish. This isn't a very long-lived fish. I don't really have an opinion on whether or not that's appropriate for croaker, but we could at least have that as an option. In terms of what to shoot for, that's always a tough question, especially since this isn't a quantified assessment. But I think what Tony mentioned is kind of a range between X percent and Y percent is probably I think is a good way to go. That will kind of, I guess, give a range of what sort of risk or comfort level the board and the public has as far as implementing measures to improve the stock over a certain period of time. I guess the question I have is when we trigger management when we have to trigger, implement management measures based on the triggers, is there a minimum set period in which these measures need to be put in place, like 3 years, or is the addendum silent on that?
I think that's how the addendum is written, how it's set up and established. Tony? Or Mike?
For SPOT, the measures would need to be in place for at least 2 years, for Croker for 3 years, and there would not be traffic light analyses conducted in the interim because any results from those would be impacted by the management. But there would be an evaluation, like we would still conduct FMP reviews, but there couldn't be additional management action triggered in the midst of that.
Tony?
And then in addition to that, you're going to have to create a new addendum to adopt these new traffic light approaches. So if you want to alter that, you can specify how you want those number of years for the regulations to stay in place.
Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assuming that we modify the program to adopt the new traffic light analysis, I'm just thinking ahead. What can we do to influence the relative abundance of this species? In our area, we've always assumed that a lot of the driving factors were environmental. And I don't recall from the assessment whether there was any proof of a stock recruitment relationship on either of these species. I don't think there was. You're shaking your head, Mr. Chair. Apparently, my recollection is correct on that. So I'm just be curious, what are some potential management measures that we could undertake that would benefit these stocks if the newly adopted traffic light analysis shows us that the triggers have in fact been tripped?
I guess, that's part of, as far as what approaches can be taken, that's one thing that we're trying to have discussion on, and that may be something that's beyond me to provide. We've heard comments that the size limits would be difficult. I guess one point to emphasize in this is that if the revised TLA is adopted by the board, it's not a question of if triggering is occurring. It's Mid-Atlantic will be triggered no matter what.
Jim Estes.
I have a very basic question. So one of the decisions that we need to make here is whether we're going to adopt these traffic light analyses with the new indices in it. And so for the folks in the Mid-Atlantic, I'm curious, if you hadn't seen this and you came to this meeting today, would the on-the-water observations that you made or your stakeholders have made show the same thing as the traffic light analysis? That's what I need to have comfort with first before even going any further.
Yeah, I have Roy Miller and then Marty.
I think I can supply part of that answer, at least certainly for what we see in the Delaware Bay region. And I would say yes to Jim's question that recreationally and commercially, we've seen a considerable drop-off in the abundance of croaker to the point where they've been fairly scarce in the recreational catches, particularly those in excess of the 10-inch minimum size limit that our state has. I'm sorry? It's 8-inch for croaker? I'm sorry, the 8-inch size limit for croaker, John corrected me. But anyway, fishing's been fairly poor for croaker for several years now, and spot abundance has not been high either.
Marty?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, Jim, I would echo Roy's observations. We have a lot of discussions, both formally in our FinFish Advisory Committee setting and also just on the fly with folks coming into the office. We have several rental boat fleets that serve individuals that like to go out, and this is their targeted species. And we consistently get feedback that things have dropped off and are not what they are for both species. So this is a very important issue for us.
Okay. Lynn, did you want to comment from Maryland?
I would just echo that we have currently a 9-inch size limit in place for croaker, but we have heard concerns from our constituents about spot.
Okay. Right. Well, the first thing I think we'd have to do is decide whether or not, as Jim said, are we going to accept these new recommendations from the TC using the regional approach. And so, Tony?
You need to do an addendum to make a change because the stoplight is done through an addendum. So we would have a new addendum to approve those.
We'd have to initiate a new addendum. Lynn?
So my understanding of the process was that today we would ask the TC to go back and look at some things, and then they would bring that back in August, and we would see what they have, and at that time simultaneously initiate that addendum to accept the new TLAs if that's what's chosen, and to incorporate the options that the TC brings back. So I think that might be our, and to that end, I guess I would suggest, because of the complications with size limits, especially with spot, I'm a little less comfortable with croaker, but that the TC would explore mechanisms using season adjustments, season length and timing for spot to, and somebody can jump in here, to reduce the to get within 5% of the threshold, just as a starting point for discussion.
Okay. Okay. Any other recommendations? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems like unless there's any concerns over the technical merits of the traffic light, the new traffic light analyses, I don't see why we couldn't initiate an addendum today to incorporate those, and then in the August meeting, the technical committee comes back with the potential management options for addressing the trigger being tripped in the Mid-Atlantic.
Sounds good. Tony?
If you're going to initiate, we would take a motion to initiate.
We'd have to take a motion.
addendum.
We'd have to take a motion to initiate. So if you'd like to do so.
Okay. I need some help crafting this. Move to initiate an addendum to the spot and croaker fishery management plans. That incorporate the new traffic light analyses.
And is that a second in the motion? If I'm Martin? Gary? Adam, discussion? Adam?
So the last couple minutes we've talked about the TC giving us some advice about potential management options. Earlier in the presentation, wasn't it recommended that a PDT would develop those management options, and that in fact we had to populate it, or is this something that the TC can do in lieu of doing so?
So we would need to, typically the PDT is the body that gives advice on management options. It would typically consist of TC members, but a PDT would be the group that would provide those and would be developing a draft addendum.
So I guess what I'm just looking forward is we can initiate this today, but I think ultimately the action the board takes on it, we'd want to have some knowledge about what the implications are going to be before we act on it. So I just think in the process, we need to make sure we have that timing in sync. We don't want to come to a meeting expecting to take final action, which I don't think this board's going to take if we don't know the implications of it ahead of time.
Good point. Tony?
And just to be clear, I think Mike talked about this before, but our thought was that, that once the TC and the PDT come back, because in some cases Spot has a PDT, it doesn't have a TC, and Croker has a TC, so it's a combination, or it's the opposite of that is what it is. But we'll have folks from all arenas giving the board some advice. But for the management response and how how quickly we can respond, how much time the measures need to be in place. Those can all be things that we bring back to the board, either via the TC and the PDT. But in terms of the addendum itself, we were talking about including both the changeover to the new analyses, as well as how you respond to the management triggers that are contained in these new analyses in one document. So while we initiate this portion of the document today, how you respond may not come until August. So therefore, you may not approve a document to go out for public comment until the annual meeting. Does that make sense? Because we wouldn't want to go out for 2 addendum in a row. We know that these triggers are still going to be tripped from this year to next year because the data hasn't really changed much. And so therefore, if we're going to go out for public comment saying the triggers are tripped, we would want to let the public know what it would look like in terms of a management response to those triggers, to be as transparent and as informative as possible to the public.
Adam, is that satisfactory?
I would interpret that as the record suggesting at this point that while the words specifically say that we're doing the addendum to incorporate the new TLAs, that the intent is actually to incorporate the TLAs and have a management response.
Do you want to modify your motion to include that? Adam, did you want to modify your motion to include that?
It's not my motion, so I'll pass.
I'm sorry. Chris, would you want to modify your motion to include that?
Yes, I think for full clarity's sake, that I would recommend doing that.
Marty, you okay with that?
I am, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Lynn, you have a question?
Yeah, I do, Mr. Chair, and part of me wants to go back to the slide in Mike's presentation that showed the timeline. I still would, I think, feel more comfortable initiating this, and I agree that these new TLAs should be incorporated, but I would feel more comfortable initiating an addendum when we have all the pieces in place, because now we're all going to go home and we're going to say, yes, we initiated an addendum, but as Adam said, we don't know what the implications are. And I think on this timeline in the presentation, today is the day, we're providing guidance on how to calculate the implications, and then in August, I think it says initiate addendum, which includes all the pieces. So with that, and I'm going to get my parliamentary terms confused, but my intent is to move to table the motion till August, or postpone, whichever the motion is that lets us take it back up again in August. Thank you.
That would be a alternative motion? Move to postpone. Do we have a second to that? I have it by Adam Kowalski. We've lost our screen. No pressure. Okay, any other discussion on this? Any opposition to this? Hearing none. Motion is approved. All right. And where does that put us? Tony?
I think that puts you, I mean, in this process, you mean?
Yeah.
So I think what we'll do is the TC and PDT will come back with response to the management questions and the time frame questions, and we'll then you can bring up the initiation of the amendment at the next meeting. And, and during that time frame, if there's anything that you want us to do in terms of the traffic light approach, to be thinking about that so that you can give that direction to staff at the August meeting as well.
Yeah, the staff is really looking for direction in the TC. I mean, last meeting, I was getting it in both ears, wanting, make sure we get some guidance. They wanted some guidance on what the board wanted done. So whatever you think, if you have an idea or thought, please bring it forward. So Lynn, you had a question, some comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to repeat for the record that in terms of direction, I think what we would like to see is some analysis of the use of season closures, of season adjustments to bring us back down to the within 5% of the thresholds, and maybe in 1 and 2 years.
Adam?
I would also recommend discussion be had and bring some information back to us if possible about whether this is fishing mortality related. Can we do this through fishing mortality, or is the belief, we hear climate change, environmental factors, are there other things going on that are impacting these TLAs, and that is not fishing mortality? So any information that can come back to inform us better, I think would be helpful.
Good point. Roy?
I agree with Adam. I think to the suite of things to be considered, bag limits, creel limits, that type of thing, I wouldn't restrict it at this point in time to just looking at seasonal restrictions, but leave the door open for other considerations in terms of management and response. Thanks.
All good ideas. Lynn?
I just wanted to concur with Roy that the examination of bag limits, I think, would be another important step.
Jim Estes.
I completely agree with what Adam's statement was. Is this some mortality that's not being caused by fishing? I'd like to get some idea about how realistic that is for staff to try to determine that.
When we were tasked with looking at the TLA, we did specifically for croaker look at this, because croaker does have this beautiful cyclical pattern in the harvest that you may have all noticed, and it was challenging to make it statistically a thing, but we would continue to try, particularly if it was something that the board wanted us to pursue more. There's more we could try, and there's more we could look at for sure, but it's hard to do, and I will also remind you we don't have a stock assessment that's approved for either of these, so we don't have a fishing mortality. All we have is the traffic light for management, so without a stock assessment, it is more difficult.
Wilson Laney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm sure Kristen and Jeff have probably seen these. I know that some work has been done, to Adam's point, looking at the relationship between croaker abundance cycles and environmental variables. I thought I had those papers right in front of me here, but I can't find them at the moment. But so there is a body of work out there that I think speaks to that particular question. And there's also some work by Diamond et al. That looked at the impact of shrimp bycatch on spot and croaker populations, or maybe just croaker populations. So I think that the TC PDT can look over that literature and maybe, provide some information back to the board about how those factors enter into population abundance for at least one of those species, maybe not both.
Yeah, we have both of those papers, and we did reference them, but again, it remains a challenge how you tie that to the TLA, which doesn't really have a place for that.
Any other discussion on this topic? All right. Hearing none, if you have any ideas, any thoughts, I mean, we had some good ones today, but if there's any other ones, please come forward, talk, let Mike or I know, or somebody on your TC let them know. I mean, because the TC is looking for some guidance from us, so that they can concentrate their efforts as much as possible. All right. Moving on. Oh, wait, Wilson, always? Okay.
Well, I did have one other question, Mr. Chairman, and based on the comments that were made by various and sundry board members, is it the general sense of the board, though, that they like the new measures and that at some point they would be prepared to adopt those new measures? I mean, from my perspective, I have a conflict of interest here because I'm on the TC or the PDT, one or the other, but it seems to me that those do improve the utility of the traffic light analysis for, providing management advice. And as we've all noted, it's the devil's in the details of what sort of management response you have to make to get it down. Those points have already been made, but is my perception correct? Again, based on Chris's and Marty's motion, it seems to me there is support for adopting those at some point.
I see nodding of head. I think it's, we're bringing more data and more indices into these TLAs, and I think that's a good thing. And I thought the approach was well handled, and it made a lot of sense. And I think most people around the table are in agreement that we're in support of these new methods in doing this. All right, I'm seeing some people looking at me. It's time for lunch, I'm hearing. So we will break, everyone get lunch, and maybe we can come back in, and maybe Mike can start. I don't know if we want to. We'll take like 20 minutes, and we'll come back in and bring your food in here, and we'll try to start back up and start dealing with Kobe, okay? Kobe is next, right?
Yeah, Kobe's next.
It's empty in here. They're already out the door. Again, for people who are just joining us, I'm Pat Gear. I'm the chairman of this committee, and we're moving on to item number 6. Updated the CDR 58 Cobia stock ID workshop. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By the time this is done, you all will be tired of hearing my voice. So today I'll go over several aspects of COBIA stock ID assessment and then management actions that are being taken and will need to be taken. First of all, I'll talk about the CDAR 58 stock ID workshop that was held in April in Charleston, South Carolina. The final report deadline is later on this month with a peer review workshop scheduled for June in Charleston, South Carolina. The big takeaway from this stock ID workshop is that the preliminary results indicate that there's a transition area between Brevard County, Florida and Brunswick, Georgia, with distinct biological stocks to the north and south. A couple finer points within the stock ID report is that there was some substructure identified within the Atlantic stock, and there's improving tagging information from programs that are starting within the next year or so and have been started within the past year. So there should be some improvements looking into future assessments as far as the tagging information that is available, but has certainly picked up from what it used to be. But the large takeaway that comes from this is that the results do not disagree with the current management boundary, and so there will likely be a recommendation to maintain the current boundary of the Florida-Georgia border being the line between the Gulf and the Atlantic stocks. At the last meeting, the South Atlantic Board tasked the COBIA TC with the motion that's shown on the screen. Just wanted to update on the progress with this. A call was held earlier this month for the COBIA TC. And on that call, the TC determined that they would need to have a follow-up call with some staff from MRIP to clarify some of the methods for the recreational landings estimation, specifically how certain expansions occur for instances like COBIA where there may be catches within a very protracted time period that may be smaller than a wave, and how different sites are weighted within the whole estimation process. Right now, the TC is finalizing a letter that they're intending to send over to some MRIP staff to schedule this call, and within that letter they have some specific questions. They have a group of about 4 questions that they'll pose to the MRIP staff that will help them in their evaluation of different methods by which to determine the harvest impact of management measures on COBIA. One thing that I just wanted to remind the board of, and one reason why I'm bringing up this board tasking right now is just to give assurance that the TC is working on the task, but at the same time, our TC has 5 members, all of which have been part of the stock ID workshop process. They will all likely be part of the data contribution for the upcoming CDAR assessment. So they're playing a lot of different roles within the realm of COBIA right now, and this board tasking is one of many. So that's one reason why there may not be as immediate results as there could be if there were not an ID workshop and an assessment going on all at the same time. Moving on to the next stage of the CDAR 58 process is the CDAR 58 stock assessment. Draft terms of reference and a draft schedule were included in your briefing materials, and some of the dates to highlight are a data workshop scheduled for November 27th through the 30th, tentatively scheduled for those dates later on this year, then a review workshop in late July through early August of next year, with a final report submission date of September 6th, 2019. As a partner in COBIA management right now, the South Atlantic Board has the opportunity to provide edits to the terms of reference. The final approval is by the South Atlantic Council, but we can provide them with recommendations If you have any, after reviewing the terms of reference and the schedule from the materials, if you have any edits that you think require discussion among the entire board today, then we can have that discussion. But if there are more edits that that you think would be more easily incorporated without a greater group discussion, then you can feel free to just email those to me. I'll accept those edits through 5 p.m. next Thursday. That'll give me enough time to incorporate all of them, send kind of a final draft out to the board before I submit the entire group of edits to the South Atlantic Council in time for their June meeting materials. Also associated with that assessment process, I'm working with CDAR and council staff to draft a list of suggested participants. I actually, about an hour ago, got our first draft of the suggested participants list. I'll have a call with them within the next couple of weeks to basically talk about which agency is going to be appointing which individuals, and I'll be emailing the board that appointment information in the coming weeks. So just stay tuned to your email and you'll be hearing from me regarding that. So at this point I can pause in case there's any discussion that wants to be had about draft terms of reference.
There any discussion or questions or about the TORs? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only one suggestion I have is for number 7, which deals with future research areas such as sampling, fishery monitoring, and stock assessment, is maybe to include something about providing recommendations for methods to improve the precision and estimates of uncertainty in recreational landings, to get at the main challenge we have with cobia management, and for the stock assessment too, is just the very uncertain recreational harvest estimates that we deal with on a regular basis.
Yeah, good point. Any other ones? Well, if you have any, please get them to Chris. You have your TC members as well, if there's any or your staff in general, just so they have any things they want to add or have any comments to this, get them to Chris, before the deadline. Not to Chris, to Mike, I'm sorry. Okay. Moving on. Right. Okay, we're going to get ready to talk. This is probably the crux of our cobia discussion that we're going to have today. We're going to be talking about the South Atlantic Council sent a letter to the Commission back in March requesting, how the Commission would is going to manage in federal waters, and we're going to have a discussion about that today. So, Mike, you have a few slides on that.
So there have been a few letters that have been sent back and forth from different bodies interested in cobia. So the first one is a letter from the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council that's in your briefing materials, and there are several questions listed verbatim in regular text right there from that letter, with kind of an overarching point of how and when will ASMFC request NOAA fisheries to manage cobia in federal waters in the absence of a council FMP? That's kind of the big question. So what measures would we request of NOAA fisheries, and what would be kind of the timing of that process? In your supplemental materials, there was also another letter from the Southeast Regional Office that detailed kind of some of the interaction that that goes on between NOAA fisheries and the Commission in the case of Amendment 31 being approved and management being transferred over to the Commission. Right now, the COBIA ISFMP supports complementary management, but does not have a mechanism in place for management of federal waters without the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP. So within that letter, CIRO has requested that the ISFMP be amended to address COBIA management in federal waters. The Commission would develop measures through the ISFMP amendment and request NOAA fisheries to implement these measures in federal waters. And there are a couple of suggestions within that letter as far as the options for what can be put in place in federal waters. Would there be coastwide measures? Would there be a consistent federal season or compliance with the landing states measures? And that's something that as staff, we would look to the board. It seems that we are going to have an amendment in order to accept sole management of COBIA. So we would be looking to the board as far as what they would want to include in such an amendment. Potential timeline for that amendment to take place. What you see on the screen is as aggressive a timeline as is possible, and there are a couple places in there that I'll highlight. But the beginning of this process would involve a motion today that would have this amendment initiated upon the approval of Amendment 31 to the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP. We would go through our amendment process with final action potentially for May 2019. One thing within that timing that I would want to note is the public comment period on the public information document between August meeting and October meeting of this year. With our processes as far as how many days a document must be out in order for public hearings to occur, we would need to meet a very, very strict time schedule for public hearings within a relatively short time frame. So just be mindful of that if we're going to, if the board would want to pursue this timing of the course of action. A reminder that the CDAR 58 assessment is scheduled for completion in September of 2019. So rather than have two potential actions back to back with possible board action in response to the assessment results, what can be done is the amendment can be written in a way that allows some transition from the current management regime, which if the board were to choose, in the amendment to just continue on initially with, as far as the recreational side, the RHL, or continue on with commercial measures that are very similar to what are in place with the current ISFMP, the amendment could be written such that a transition to some other management mechanism that there's been interest from the board in past meetings, such as an F-based management system or something where there's not an annual coastwide quota, something of that sort. That could be done through an addendum process if we're careful about how we write the amendment initially. So there would be that addendum in response to any assessment results would potentially be annual meeting of next year or later. But this is kind of a possible timeline for that ASMFC amendment process. So just recapping what we're looking for feedback from the board on today is how will ASMFC, how will the board request NOAA manage federal waters? What are the options that would be included in the amendment to the ISFMP? And that would involve initiating that ISFMP today, contingent upon approval of the CMP-FMP by the South Atlantic Council. And sorry, one more point for consideration is also what would be requested of NOAA Fisheries to implement in the interim time period. So there's a time period between June of this year and as soon as May of next year when we would be going through our amendment process, but the South Atlantic Council will have already released cobia. So what are the temporary measures that the board would desire to be in place in that interim? And those would be requested of NOAA Fisheries for implementation.
Okay, Greg Waugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the South Atlantic Council's perspective, I'd like to express our appreciation for your continued cooperation in working through this. I think we're going to have to get Mike a spot in our office in Charleston. He's spending so much time down there. But just to update you, when we tried to approve this at our March meeting, there was a question about the stock ID, and some NOAA GC raised some legal deficiencies in terms of what was going to happen in federal waters. The stock ID issue has been resolved. That's not changing. The Gulf Council has now adopted the preferred alternative of transferring management of the Atlantic group. So they're on board with the same alternative. And Bob participated on a conference call there and heard some of those same concerns. So the two councils are on schedule to approve this amendment in June, the South Atlantic at June 10th through the 15th, and then the Gulf the following week. And our intention, should the two councils approve that, is to get that document to the agency for review sometime in August is sort of the target timing. The legal questions, I just wanted to touch on them just briefly. There was a question about what would happen in federal waters, and what would be helpful for us to address that is to get an indication from you all that you are beginning an amendment, as Mike outlined, to the interjurisdictional cobia FMP. And if we had that information for our June meeting, that would be very helpful. The regional administrator in his letter has indicated that he's ready to concurrently implement the removal of regulations from our cobia FMP and then through ACFMA to implement whatever regulations you all request. So that to the extent that you're comfortable at this meeting giving some indication of whether you would like to see the current regulations continue in federal waters in the interim, that would certainly help calm some concerns of some of our members. And again, just thanks for addressing this quickly. I know you have a full agenda. We appreciate your continued help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Greg. Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is just a clarification for myself. So the federal regulations we're speaking of are only in the interim, correct, while we're in that transitionary period? Once you're released and we're adopted, that's no longer an issue, or is it?
So there would need to be some recommendation from the board to NOAA for regulations that would be put in place when the council releases cobia, when Amendment 31 goes through. There would need to be some recommended measures there. Now, if the board wanted to keep those measures, going into the future, then those would just be included in the amendment in the amendment to the ISFMP into the Commission's amendment. But there would need to be something in place to recommend to NOAA Fisheries, because there's that time period where we don't have anything in writing in place, and the council has then released their management authority.
Doug Hayman's in and Chris Metzap.
And that would be an extension of state regulations into federal waters that the Commission would be approving, basically, because multiple states have differing regs, correct?
Not It could be that. That's one of the options that could be brought forth, or the board could elect some other option that's in place if they wanted to take, the coast-wide measures and keep those into the federal waters or something of that sort. That's what we're looking for some guidance on.
I have Chris, then Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess to start off the discussion on potential interim measures, I'd recommend coast-wide commercial measures that are currently in place in both FMPs. And then for recreational measures, require anglers to comply with the state they plan to land their fish.
Okay, I have Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chris covered the majority of what I was going to mention. And I think in terms of any season, that would be covered by landing consistent with the state regulations in which you're landing as well.
Okay. Jack McGovern and then Mel Bell.
To Doug's point, there wouldn't be an extension of state regulations into federal waters necessarily. That would be one option, like Mike said, but what's been recommended, and I think Mike stated this by our attorneys, is that when Atlantic cobia is removed from the coastal migratory pelagics FMP, at the same time and the same rule, regulations will be put into place through the authority of the Atlantic Coastal Act, and so that would be different from what you're saying, I think.
Okay, Mel, and then Doug Hammonds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a slightly different take on the in terms of the recreational regs as they apply to the state in which landed. So we have an issue in that South Carolina is perhaps a little more restrictive than our neighbors to the south and north related to the recreational, the boat limit. So we're 1 fish per person, but a 3-fish boat limit. And so what this sets up, if we go that route, is, and we know this occurs, is that we get folks fishing out of Savannah, Georgia, up on our artificial reefs, returning to Savannah, Georgia, while they're mixed with our folks out there that are coming in and out of South Carolina ports. So you could potentially set up a situation, which we would like to avoid, where folks coming from a state that is less restrictive can have 6 fish in the boat because that's what their state allows, whereas my fishermen are held to 3 fish in the boat. And it's their waters, their federal waters, their artificial reef that they paid for and all. So what I would prefer to see is a requirement that you adopt the most, if the waters you're in, if those waters are more restrictive, then it's the waters you're fishing in. And I realize from an enforcement standpoint that that involves on the water intercept type enforcement. But I could see this happening where the Betsy Ross Reef, for instance, which is a real popular reef that's fished by our southern county, Beaufort County fishermen, as well as folks from Georgia, you could have people being held to a different standard out there on the water, and then that, of course, that depending on where your boat's registered or where you're going with the fish. So that really. The where you're landed part, where you land them aspect, I would prefer it to be allow the state to actually extend its law, its regulation out into federal waters and enforce that in federal waters.
Okay, Tony.
Mel, we do, like, for example, we sort of do this in summer flounder, although it'll be a little bit different on how we promulgate the regulations because it'll be under ACFACMA. But for federal waters, you can't extend your state waters. So if the reef is in federal waters, then it's still the home state that you're going to, whatever is the more restrictive of the 2 measures. So if a Georgia vessel is fishing in federal waters, it can fish under the Georgia rules and then it goes home to Georgia. If a South Carolina vessel is out there, then it fishes under the South Carolina and goes home to that. I don't think we have the authority to extend your state waters into federal waters and then put that on another state's fishermen, because there's no boundary line in which those state edges go out into federal waters. I do have a follow-up question for Jack, though. I thought in Roy's letter, one of the options was to, it was either that we would ask NOAA to continue the current federal regulations in federal waters until such time we made a request to NOAA to make changes, or that we could extend the current state water recreational regulations into federal waters. Are both options available, or is it just the first option in this sort of interim period?
So I'm looking at the letter here. So I think the two options were, one was where the commission could just recommend that there be a state season, a federal season, and just say it's like from May to October or something, or that where it's landed, the fishermen could just abide by the season where the fish are landed. But I think both options are available.
Doug Haymans and Chris.
Yeah, so I started with a point to Jack, and then I wanted to agree with Mel, and now it's all three. So, which one do I want to tackle first? I guess, Jack, my point in the question earlier about extending state regs out in the federal waters was because we have a different reg than North Carolina does. And so, if we go with the council's reg in the federal waters, I'm fine because I match the council. But if we do away with council reg and we just are working off of state regs, then, which one are we going to go by? And that's why I think, agreeing with Mel, we need to have the state regs extending out in the federal waters. The biggest question to me, though, that came from the council meeting last time was to the enforceability question was, can our LE guys enforce a rule in South Carolina and in the federal waters off of South Carolina? And, I'm looking at, well, everybody's got a JEA agreement. They should be able to. They shouldn't just have to enforce Georgia regs because they're a Georgia LE guy. They've all got these JEA agreements to allow them to enforce regs in federal waters. So I don't know that we've answered that question, but I think we need a firm answer to that one. And then to whoever's point over here about commercial being the same, well, I took the extra step of making commercial a little more restrictive in Georgia. I held the commercial guys to a 36-inch limit rather than the 33, I think, that we've got in federal. And so now I'm in a bind with that one if we don't do the same thing with commercial that we do with recreational. So that's a lot.
Chris and then Mel.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Wouldn't be a Kobe meeting without getting very complicated. And I appreciate the concerns that Doug and Mel have. What Mel highlighted as a potential issue, I think, happens all the time with summer flounder, where you have close border states fishing common waters, and a person in state A can land a smaller fish than the person in state B, even though they're fishing right next to each other. And I mean, if we could extend state measures out to federal waters, I think it would solve a lot of that. I'm having a hard time figuring out how that would work, especially based on Tony's comments and how enforcement would handle it. The reason I made the suggestion that I did was to try to avoid a different set of measures in federal waters versus state waters. That creates some issues for our enforcement officers, and it creates a lot of confusion for the anglers as far as what they can and can't do in federal waters compared to coming back into North Carolina. That's where the suggestion of the anglers are held to whatever state they're planning to return to would take care of some of those issues. Based on just what Doug and Mel said, that sounds like it's a little more complicated to the south of us based on some of the extra steps their states have taken for their commercial and recreational fisheries. So I'm just kind of struggling to see a way out as far as something that'll satisfy everyone at this time.
Okay. Mel, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and I'd follow what Tony was saying, but I think, there are lines that are drawn out, which are extensions of the state lines out into federal waters for purposes of whether you're having discussions about things going on with BOEM or other issues. So there are legally defined lines, and they can relate to fisheries as well. So it's a matter of how can we, if the states are indeed going to be kind of responsible for managing a fishery in their waters and outside in federal waters, we've got to be able to regulate that somehow. So, and I know I'm going to put Jim on the spot, I guess. I know Florida deals with some issues down there related to boundaries with other folks and differing regs and things, and whether it's federal, state, or Gulf Atlantic. But, they may have some experience down there. And I know I've talked to Jessica about that before, about kind of how they do it down there. And one of the tricks was the enforcement piece where, if our officers are offshore operating under our JEA and they have the South Carolina regs, that's what they would enforce. But so I guess I would just go back and ask us if any way possible we could research that legally or whatever to figure out how we can make this happen, because any place you're going to have these differences, this is what you're going to run into. And let me also say that our approach to management of cobia, particularly in our southern waters, which was the bulk of our fisheries, is driven by things that we did over decades with that fishery, and we are trying to rebuild that distinct population segment of fish. And those fish do not recognize the 3-mile limit. We know through acoustic tracking that they go back and forth. And so our ability to help that population rebuild depends on our ability to extend our management approach into federal waters.
Thanks, Mel. Tony?
Two things. One, I did try to do a little investigation to answer Doug's question about whether or not a Georgia DNR vessel or officer could give a citation to a South Carolina boat. And it's my understanding of how the JEA seems to be changing in the states, and I don't know about if it's different in every state or not, but that it's been watered down a little bit, and that the state officer makes a recommendation to NOAA to put an infraction in place for something that happened in federal waters. So I'm not 100% sure if they can make that recommendation for another state's vessel or not, and we will look into that to try to figure it out. The second part to my question, I guess to Greg, would be if we can't resolve this question of enforcement and how you want to deal with extension into federal waters, would the South Atlantic Council and the Gulf States Council be satisfied with, option A, and if that doesn't work, then the second option B, which I think would just be to leave in place the current recreational federal waters regulations until such time we make a further recommendation to NOAA Fisheries, and that would be after we finalize the amendment process, if Amendment 31 were to pass.
Yeah, I don't think we have a strong preference either way. Obviously, Mel and Doug have pointed out concerns at the state level, but in terms of addressing the federal issue and the NOAA GC concerns, as long as we have an indication that you all are moving forward with an amendment and that you're in the process of figuring out exactly what you're going to ask And if it's those two alternatives, I think that works fine for the councils finalizing their action.
Okay, Wilson had his hand up, and then I have Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Mel used the DPS word, and Chris used the word complex, and Mike used the word future. So I want to challenge the board to think about the future. Should at some point in time we have enough genetic data to resolve whether or not there are substocks north of that Georgia-Florida line. If it turns out that there are substocks, and I believe, Mel, that South Carolina, I thought, had pretty much definitively shown that Port Royal Sound population is distinct, then you're going to have to factor that into management, and that will complicate the picture further. So that's something, again, doesn't need to be addressed at this point in time until the data are there. We have graduate students at North Carolina State, Riley Gallagher, and I know there's a grad student in Virginia who are out there catching cobia and taking tissue and sticking acoustic transmitters in them. So hopefully that picture will become clearer, but it could be, as early as 2 or 3 years from now. And so I don't think it's premature to start thinking about what happens if hypothetically you wind up defining some stock substructure that you need to deal with.
Thanks, Wilson. I have Adam, and then I have Bob.
My only desired contribution to the discussion of this species at this board level has been to encourage us to learn from the lessons in recreational management, black sea bass, summer flounder. The scenario that Mel described a few moments ago of two boats fishing next to each other in federal waters being held to very different regulations is exactly what got people around the table for the policy board discussion today. Any one of you from the southern states can be the next Massachusetts representative to present an appeal when we get to that point. I think it can work where the way the summer flounders plan set up is there are a set of backstop measures in federal waters, but vessels are constrained to where they land. The problem is enforcement cannot make a decision 5 or 6 miles off the beach where they're going to land. We have vessels with registrations in one state that either come and go from a port in a different state to take advantage of those regulations, or in some cases leave from one port, return to another so that they could take advantage of the regulations. What we have learned, and the direction we're trying to go as a board, is to try to keep those regulations as close as possible in the separate states if that's the route you wind up going. Having regulations where size limits are 3-4 inches separate from each other, going to be a problem. Bag limits double what they are, going to be a problem. But if you go that route, it can work. You just have to be committed to working together to keep those regulations as similar as possible.
Thank you, Adam, for that perspective. We appreciate that. And I have Bob.
Thank you. I, like Adam, would like to keep appeals to a minimum, if at all possible. I just want to talk about urgency for a second. This board has promised the South Atlantic Council a description of our intention and moving forward, and hopefully we can do that before their June meeting. But as far as urgency goes about establishing the exact regulations that we're going to ask for, we may have a little bit more time, because even if both councils approve Amendment 31 in June, that doesn't mean they're out of the game. That doesn't mean the federal regulations are dissolved at that point. There has to be I think, Jack, a 9-month or so process to change that management from, to remove the Atlantic stock from the federal plan and migrate over to ASMFC plan under AFICMA, et cetera. So, there is some time under that, or there's some time after the council approves the plan that the current regulations are going to continue on until they don't. So that, there has to be a conscious decision to change those. And if we need more time during that transition, I think we can work with the federal government to figure out the details, as Mel is suggesting, to do a little research if we need to. But if you look at the letter, Roy Crabtree's letter that is in supplemental material, they seem to be recognizing, or he seems to be recognizing some of the concerns that are around the table. He's talking about size limit in the letter, but then he says, to accommodate a state's larger size limit, federal regulations could require recreational harvesters to comply with more restrictive state regulations in any state where the fish are landed. So, they're acknowledging that you can implement through federal regulation a requirement to have recreational vessels be bound by the more restrictive measure from the state they're coming in. It doesn't necessarily, or they're coming from. It doesn't always solve this boats fishing next to each other, but it does recognize that federal regulations can require vessels to be bound by the more restrictive rule from their home state.
Any other comments? I see people getting their bags ready, so if we're going to make, do we have to make a decision today on this?
Yeah, I think the more clear signal we can send to the South Atlantic Council, the better. I think Greg's shaking his head back there. So he may have some advice on that, but I think the more we can do today, it would be better.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, I don't think you have to have all the details nailed down, but if we have an indication that, yes, you all intend to amend your plan, and yes, you intend to craft some recommendations on what federal regulations you want continued in federal waters, I think that would be a big help to both councils to finalize the amendment in June.
And one thing to keep in mind is that if the board initiates an an amendment today, within our amendment process, we do have a public information document that goes out, public comment period on it. So that's where we would spell out different options. We'd get public input on different options for managing. That's built into the amendment process. So initiating an amendment today doesn't mean that we have to know where the amendment ends up at the end.
Doug is.
How much in the way of specifics do you need with regard to that amendment, or simply a motion to initiate an amendment, all that's required?
I think that's it. Yeah.
I think that just initiating the amendment, and then states would certainly, we would hope that board members would communicate with their state TC members and members of the plan development team as that amendment is constructed, so that the guidance can happen throughout that process.
Mr. Hammonds.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries, whatever this is, the commission initiate an amendment for cobia, the northern. Yeah, I knew somebody was going to be ahead of me. Mr. Chairman, I'd move to initiate an amendment to reflect the removal of Atlantic cobia from the Joint South Atlantic Fishery Management Council and Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council Coastal Migratory Pelagics Fishery Management Plan, and to establish recommendations for measures in federal waters.
And I see seconded by several people. Did I say Malcolm Rhodes? Doug, I must admit that was quite impressive on the fly. Discussion, Mel Bell.
Yeah, so we're on board with moving forward with this. I just wanted to make sure I got on the record what our concerns are, because they're no small concerns for us. And also, my colleagues on the South Atlantic Council have heard this spiel before, but I would just say that we learned a valuable lesson about cobia in South Carolina from having an extremely vibrant fishery, which involved heavy fishing on a spawning on fish that were spawning on a predictable basis every year. And we fished and we fished and we fished on that, which ended up being, through our genetics work, a distinct population segment. And then we watched it crash. And it's a classic example, I think, of hyperstability, the illusion of plenty. But our fishermen, because of that, they're the ones that are insisting on this more conservative approach, this more restrictive approach. Our fishermen are, because they know what we all contributed to, what they contributed to. So that's why we may be a little bit more restrictive than our neighbors to the north and south, but we learned from that experience. And I would just, as some others were pointing out, just as we look forward to the future here, if you look at the fisheries that are involved off of our various states, I believe the peak pressure on these resources, the peak landings tend to occur during the peak time of spawning. So it may be that, we're all doing this to some degree. Now, we were working in a system of fairly confined sounds and bays where we could put a tremendous amount of pressure on these fish. So if you scale up to the size of the Chesapeake Bay or pick a larger, pick a different body of water, it doesn't mean you can't do the same thing. And I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I'm just providing from South Carolina's experience a precautionary note as we move forward with cobia that if you continually fish a stock of fish during their spawning time while they're aggregated, you just got to be careful. And that's why we're insisting, and our fishermen are insisting on this approach, because they are very repentant. They are trying to make amends. They are trying to rebuild the stock because they'd like the fishery to return to some level that inside our state waters. And we've taken a much, so for instance, right now in our state waters, in the southern cobia management zone, there is no retention during the month of May. The month of May was our peak landings period. We closed down our peak landings period because we were that concerned, and the fishermen did it. And we are a legislative state. The fishermen took it to the legislature. The legislature decided to do this. So it wasn't an act of our board or an act of the department. So I just, as I mentioned, I've said the same sort of thing in front of the council, but I just wanted to get that on the record.
Thank you very much, Mel. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question for the board. Is everyone comfortable with us saying that in the interim between after the council has voted to remove cobia from their FMP and the finalization of our amendment, that we request that NOAA Fisheries maintain the current suite of federal regulations? Is everyone comfortable saying that in the interim, and that that provides some backstop so the federal waters aren't a free-for-all? And I think the federal government, I believe, can either extend their timeline to remove the species from the federal plan, which would maintain the current provisions in federal water. Are folks comfortable saying that, or do we want to ask for something different in this interim period?
I see one. Doug?
Georgia's comfortable.
Chris?
Question for Bob. So basically, what's in place under the current federal cobia plan would stay in place until our amendment is finalized? Is that what you're asking?
Yep.
Yes, with the understanding that ASMSC is going to move as briskly as possible to come up with their plan and accommodate the concerns that Doug and then Mel have raised.
Chris?
It doesn't address our immediate concerns. We're also taking care of some issues with just potential loopholes in our existing rulemaking that may solve some of that in the meantime. But I think considering that we can't really come up with a reasonable solution in the interim as far as what will satisfy our state versus what will satisfy the states of the South, I think that might be the only option to do right now.
Mel, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so our approach was to basically maintain in waters outside the southern cobia management zone was to maintain the current federal, what's in place federally. So in fact, we have a bill which is supposedly on the House floor today to basically adopt the current federal regulations and codify them in state law, because we adopt the current federal regulations by reference now. But if at some point they went away, we would potentially have a gap. But so yes, so for the interim and then next several years, we're fine with holding what we've got in terms of the federal regs.
Yeah. Do any of the Mid-Atlantic states want to chime in or comment on that? Hearing none. All right. Bob, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and hopefully that helps the council understand what, ASMFC might do in the interim while we wrap up our plan.
All right, so we have a motion on the floor. Any more discussion on this motion? I'm sorry. All right, let me read the motion. Move to initiate an amendment to reflect the removal of Atlanticobia from the Joint South Atlantic Fishery Management Council and the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council Coastal Migratory Projects Fishery Management Plan and establish recommendations for measures in federal waters. Motion by Mr. Hammonds and second by Dr. Rhodes. Is there any opposition to this motion? Any abstentions? Any null votes? Hearing none, motion is approved. Okay. Safe travels, Doug. Is there any other discussion on this topic? Okay. Mike, thank you very much. You did a great job today. Doing all these things. We have
other business.
Other business. We have one other item under business, and Chris wanted to bring up something about mackerel in North Carolina. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make this quick because I don't want to get stuck in rush hour traffic any more than anyone else. So, as you recall, Addendum 1 to the Spanish Mackerel Fishery Management Plan for ASMFC allows for a seasonal exemption from the 12-inch minimum size limit for the poundnet fishery from the months of July through September. And this is something that we've taken advantage of over the last, I think, 4 or 5 years now. And last year, we came to the board to ask if we could submit our information to do this again through an email vote, and we would like to ask that again. We have just finalized the information for this exemption, just due to the timing of the landings data and the biological data that we need. It's kind of getting progressively tougher for us to get stuff out in advance of the May meeting. So if I'm basically here to ask if the board is okay with us submitting our proposal again for 2018 and have it approved via email vote by the board.
One question, do you know when you'd be submitting that request?
I think we could submit that by next week.
Okay. Any objection to that? It's become pretty standard the last few years to do this. Hearing no objections, consider it approved. Is there any other business before the board? Hearing none, meeting is adjourned. All right, safe travels, everybody.